Welcome to all our friends from across the world. We are meeting under very, very strange circumstances. But for the past 1 year, what kept us all going was this virtual magic. And so let us celebrate and make most of the next 75 minutes. We are here today to discuss a very, very important and topical and relevant issue. That is container versus the platform. Museum as an open space for conversation. We have recently crossed 2020, which has been a phenomenal year, frightening, life-changing, and for many catastrophic. Yet, history will look upon this year as time of great reckoning. Reckoning of the fact that life, freedom, and existence itself are fragile terms. There are no constants. The contours and the parameters we build around ourselves can vanish and disappear in no time. Given these existential vagaries of life and nature, the need for direction, hope, justice, and equanimity become increasingly critical. Herein lies the importance of museums and cultural spaces across disciplines. These assume the role of contemporary citadels and temples for human thought, vision, and restitution of lasting values. During the pandemic, we found institute after institute do everything possible on the virtual realm to reaffirm man's faith in himself and life in general. Music, films, visual, and performance art took over our lives. We overcame and survived from acute existential angst. Across the virtual platforms, we met, exchanged ideas, and had conversations and dialogues. All this saved us from getting lost and prevented us from forgetting each other. We saw cultural institutions and museums of all hues join in this parley and sustain human sanity and provide solace and sanctity in times of acute turbulence and uncertainty. We saw also that, and we are here also to examine and explore how museums and cultural institutions can play a paramount role in educating, communicating, and disseminating information imaginatively and constructively. We also hope to discuss how museums can become repositories of human knowledge and history and help to sustain individual and collective freedom and raise serious questions about society and the times we live in. Museums today are not static, lifeless spaces exhibiting dead objects of art. Museums have now become live and exciting spaces to learn and discover from. Each museum has created its own narrative and individual objectives to fulfill. And today we'll examine some of those exciting ideas, wonderful stories and methodologies by distinguished professionals from the field of social science, art, and cultural studies. I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers joining us this evening. Oscar Pujol is a Catalan Indologist. He spent 17 years in the Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, taught Spanish there and obtained a PhD in Sanskrit. He has written numerous papers on many aspects of Sanskrit language and philosophy. Amongst his many contributions to India and Sanskrit is a Sanskrit Catalan dictionary containing around 60,000 entries, which took him around 12 years to complete. After having worked as director of the education programs at Casa Asia, Barcelona, he's now setting up Institute Cervantes at New Delhi. Marion Ackermann is a German art historian, curator, and museum director. She's currently the Director General of Städtische Kunstsammlungen Dresden. Sabitha Satchi is an artist and literary critic, curator, and poet based in New Delhi. She has curated the opening exhibition of MOG, Museum of Goa, in 2016, and 32 artists from countries such as the UK, France, Netherlands, Sweden, Italy, Iran, and Egypt, apart from India. She is currently curating an exhibition for the Raza Foundation. She's also a recipient of the fellowships and awards, including the Commonwealth Research Scholarship in History of Art at the UCL, London, the Paul Mellon Fellowship at the Center for British Art, Yale University, USA, the Charles Wallace Fellowship, British Council, and the Sarai CSTS Independent Fellowship, New Delhi. Gail Lord, president and co-founder of the Lord Cultural Resources. Gail is one of the world's foremost museum planners. She's also an art critic, commentator, public speaker, and co-author of 6 museum planning manuals and several books, including Cities, Museums, and Soft Power. Gail co-founded Lord Cultural Resources with her husband, Barry Lord, in 1981 to deliver specialized planning services to museums, the arts, cultural districts, and the creative economy, with the goal of making the world a better place through culture. Based in Toronto and New York, Lord has offices in Mumbai, Dubai, Los Angeles, Madrid, and Beijing. It has completed over 2,500 projects in 57 countries and 450 cities. Now we will start our wonderful discussion today, and we're all looking forward to it. We'll start with Gail, please.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction. It's a tremendous honor to be speaking at the world's first museum biennial on such a fascinating topic. I wanted to reflect a little bit on biennials. You know, there were pre-pandemic, there were 300 biennials in the world, and yet this is the very first, to my knowledge, museum biennial. I think the history of biennials is really interesting because they started inside museums. Then in the 1990s, they migrated outside museums. And I think now this reflects a fundamental change in changing museum culture, that you're actually, a biennial is being sponsored about museums. And I think it's fantastic. So I'd like
Sound is gone.
Okay, our chat, that's fine. It's just what happens. So let's look at the next slide, please. Yeah, our chairman already told you the whole story about my company. It only remains for me to say one thing. This year, we're 40 years old. So we've been doing all this for 40 years. We've learned a lot about museums. I'm going to start my talk, however, with the next slide, which is a picture of a work of art. If we could have the next slide, please. A work of art that was created 5 days ago in Florence, Italy. And when I saw a photograph of it on my feed, I couldn't resist opening our talk with it. It's by a French artist, J.R., and it I guess symbolically rips off the front of the Palazzo Strozzi in Venice, in Florence, with this optical illusion, which is, you know, you have the museum as a container, a Renaissance container in this case, and then ripping off the front. It's a trompe l'oeil effect, in fact, to show us kind of images, imaginative images of the contents inside. So I think it brings our topic, even though it's trompe l'oeil, because everything's very tricky these days, it brings our topic into perspective. Can we see the next slide? Okay, so perspective on museums. What were they and what are they in the post-COVID-19 world? Well, museums have always been containers of one type or another. Today, I would say in the post-COVID world, especially after what Madam Sarkar has told us, as we've turned and pivoted towards new technology, museums are about content. So we move from container as the main focus to content. And then it's only a very small step from content, as you know, to platform, but we'll get into that in a moment. Museums were isolated, today collaborative. They were very inward focused, today outward looking. Object centered, of course, on their collections, that seemed natural. visitor-centered. And I guess I want to say that one of the early things that we did in our company back in 1983, we published our first book. It's a long time ago, but we came up with a very radical idea that museums are for people. Now, this seems like a normal idea today, but in 1983, it was actually a radical idea. And we can perhaps get into that. The step from saying museums are for people, museums are about content, to museums are platforms. I mean, it's a trajectory of cultural change. These museums in the past were very much the omniscient, godlike voice of authority. And I know that a number of our speakers are going to comment on that. Today, they really house multiple perspectives, or they struggle to do so. They were passive places. Today, they are relatable or active spaces. And I think museums have always been multidisciplinary. That's not new, but that was side by side, disciplines talking to each other side by side. Today, they're interdisciplinary, and that's very different, much more challenging, and perhaps, well, it's cultural change. The next slide, please. We have to go quickly. So now here's a great example. This is the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And you can see a photograph of the building by night. What a container. Obviously, buildings are still containers. That's clear. They contain a lot of different things. I'm happy to say that stay on for the museum tours toward the end of the week, because this museum is on the museum tour, and I think you're going to find it utterly fascinating. It opened in 2014, and I had the privilege to work on this for 14 years. So it's something pretty major in my career, my life, and also for Canada, of course. Now let's look inside. Let's pretend we're JR. Let's rip off and here we go inside. And you can see that inside is definitely a platform. Here's the main gallery space. There are galleries all around. There's virtual material up above, and there's a platform, a performance in this case by an Indigenous artist. So I think that this play between container and content, between container and platform, is actually a major change in the museum world. We can look at the next slide. So how do you plan institutions that are, after all, changing? Culture around them is changing. Museums are about culture, so naturally museums are changing. Well, we look at this is a fan diagram. There are 6 different folds in the fan, and each one of these folds is constantly changing. So we have institutional change. So the Human Rights Museum, which I'm going to use as my example, started life as a private initiative, a public-private initiative. It opened as a national museum. And this is a huge change that has to be anticipated by the building. The market and the visitors. This is a national market. Is it an international market? What about the local population, which is about 10% Indigenous people? How to relate to all these different markets, something that the building, the container, has to consider. Collections. Well, this is a museum that is as much a collection of human stories as it is of objects. And so we now know that pretty much most museums are collections that are both tangible and intangible. This is a museum of intangible. So we can go through all 6 folds of the fan, but I leave it with you to say, of course, the 6th one is technology and communications. And as Dr. Sarkar pointed out, technology and communications maybe go to the front of the line in the post-COVID world and has a tremendous impact on everything that museums do. If I were Marshall McLuhan, who's of course Canadian, I'm sure many people would know this, he would say that the reason why the BiharMuseumBiennale is happening in the year 2021 is because museums have made a fundamental shift to a new technology. That's how he would look at it. And he would say, no wonder you're talking about platforms. Technology has taken us to this place. So let's look at another slide, please. So looking at institutional change. In the past, I'm sorry, these phones keep ringing, I can't stop it, so I hope you don't hear it. Museums were line departments. Today, they're mainly civil society institutions. Museums were buildings as containers. Today, and let's go to the next slide quickly, they are buildings as expression. Oh my gosh, what's happened to this container? It's exploded into an expression by an architect, namely Daniel Libeskind. And I think that what's really fascinating is that this is quite a traditional museum. It's a multidisciplinary museum of nature. Used to be a museum of man, but now it's of humans, and nature, culture, and history, and it's exploded. so that even people, and I think that this is an important point, who never go to the museum get a message about the museum. Let's look at the next slide, please. Okay, so marketing visitors, I'm not going to go through all 6, just 2. Fewer museums. Today there are more museums. Passive visitors, engaged guests. Big change. And I like the next slide because there's an important Bihar reference to it. So this is really interesting. Our passive audience, a group of school kids, all wearing their uniforms and looking very nice. They're pushed through the museum. They barely have a chance to even look at an object, let alone reflect on it, let alone talk about it. They're told to be quiet all the time. And on the right, we see a beautiful moment from the Bihar Children's Gallery, which is part of the museum that we planned here in Bihar, if I may say here. And there are the children exploring a cave. And so what a tremendous change and what a positive change. Children from being passive, pushed through to being engaged guests. And of course, it has an impact on what are museums. Let's look at the next slide. I think this is the change in collections I already spoke of, and we'll move on to the next slide. Right, so this is actually my last slide. I think I'm on time. I just want to dwell on it for a moment. Museums as platform does not mean museums as soapbox. I don't know if everybody understands the concept of a soapbox, but a soapbox was in the 19th century a kind of a platform that speakers would use and set it up, and then they would make a speech about what have you. It was a very important form of democratization, that you could actually make a speech somewhere in a park, stand on a soapbox, and say what you wanted. It was a rather key moment in freedom of speech. I think that it's very important for us to understand that despite all this change, or perhaps because of it, museums are enormously trusted institutions. And what's interesting about the statistics on trust is they're trusted by people also who never go into them, because the data tells us that somewhere between, in England it's 70%, in the United States and Canada it's around 90% of people trust museums. Now we know that 90% of the population doesn't go to museums. So therefore it means that they're trusted rather universally in society. And so to me, this is a rather important message around becoming a platform, is that there are 4 key steps, you see them on the diagram, to remaining trusted. As we become platforms, how do we retain trust and build trust? Well, we have to consult and listen. Consulting is not enough, listening is everything. We have to be relevant and transparent, transparency being even more important than relevance. I think seeking relevance without seeking transparency is quite problematic. We have to demonstrate the scientific basis of what we do. Science is everything. It could be the science of art history, nature, history, whatever. And also, and I think that this is the hardest one for many of us, I speak for myself, we have to acknowledge all sides of the story. That doesn't mean tell all sides of the story, but acknowledge all sides of the story. So that is my brief presentation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gail, for the excellent overview that you presented today. Of course, we'll go into our discussion mode soon, but thank you very much. And now we move on to Sabitha Satchi, our next speaker.
Hello, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bihar Museum and Dr. Alka Pandey for inviting me to this extremely important and seminal, the first of its kind, really, the Museum Biennale. I'm going to be talking about something a little different from what Gail spoke about. I'm going to try and relate the idea of the content in the museum with its politics. My presentation, which will be a brief one, is entitled Decolonizing the Museum, Engaging with the Archive in the 21st Century. How does one reimagine the role of museums in contemporary times? Is it possible to bring into the experience of viewing modes of engagement other than that of a static archive? What role does the colonial archive play in its being situated in the erstwhile imperial metropolis? What kind of specular technologies and critical practices of viewing do we bring to have a conversation with the museum space? Are there non-colonial ways of organizing the museum, given that it is a colonial artifact? Are there non-colonial ways of organizing the museum? The Persian Ajaib Ghar, or the House of Curiosities, for example, where the objects' relationship to each other is more hermeneutic than linear. I'm going to focus on colonial painting in 19th century Patna in what Mildred Archer calls the company style. Late 18th and early 19th century saw a huge number of European travelers painting scenes of India. The views sold as souvenirs, these are some examples of these actually. The views sold as souvenirs in aquatints or lithographs not only produce place as a portable object, but bring into being and is brought into being by a complex set of relationships between the collector, the object, and the artist, where the modality for thinking about the value of the souvenir as commodity can be viewed, in Susan Stewart's words, as arising not from need or use, but out of the necessarily insatiable demands of nostalgia. John Fro actually takes this idea forward and speaks about the souvenir as having as its vocation, the continual reestablishment of a bridge between origin and trace. Now, I'm going to be looking at the art object in the museum as a souvenir, and what does it mean for us to be looking at the art object as a souvenir, which evokes a certain moment of the past and brings a certain element of nostalgia. The nostalgia is then necessarily is a continual seeking after the moment of origin through the fetish object of the souvenir. With the decline of patronage by indigenous emperors who are reduced to ruin by the English East India Company in the 19th century, Indian artists find new patrons, often in high-ranking officers of the company, who mimetically reproduce Mughal royal patronage by commissioning albums or sets of paintings. One such vernacular kalam or style evolved in Patna in the 19th century, when some artists moved from Banaras and Murshidabad, as well as further afield in Agra and Delhi, to Patna, which was the center of the opium trade. They plied their trade in the bazaar, making souvenirs for patrons, often creating sets or firqa of images, typically of everyday life and skillful labor, or portraits done either on paper or on mica that is locally mined in Bihar. The artist who has entered the bazaar catalogs others like himself in ironic mimicry and inscribes himself socially, perhaps in class identification. Now, in this particular image that I'm showing here, the image on the left is that of, it could be either a clerk or it could even be the artist who's making a drawing. So there is a sort of, it's almost like a self-portrait of the artist who typically actually belonged to the Kayastha caste, which was the clerical caste. And this is typically how they would sit while making their account books, or even actually while drawing. So there is a kind of mimetic reflection and and an attempt to self-portraiture that you see in the sets. They plied their trade in the bazaar, making souvenirs for patrons, often creating sets or firqa of images, typically of everyday life. The artist who has entered the bazaar catalogs others like himself in ironic mimicry and inscribes himself socially, perhaps in class identification and empathy. In the firqa, there is the image of the silversmith beating silver, women carding cotton and cleaning fish, a barber shaving a client, and the writer or artist or the clerk at work, among other serial images of occupations. The Patna sets and albums are remarkable in the sheer proliferation of this type of image. This unique mimesis, where the self is mimicked by inserting it into the midst of a society, that is both like and unlike itself simultaneously, not only subverts the encyclopedic cataloging by the imperial idea of the museum, but aligns itself agentially with the artisanal and the laboring classes. Now, I would like to briefly focus on a set of 19 drawings by artist Shivalal in the South Asia collection in the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. This remarkable set is a series of sketches documenting the process of the manufacture of opium in the opium factory at Gulzari Bagh, Patna. These drawings on mica were done by Shivalal, who lived between 1817 and 1887, at the suggestion of Dr. D.R. Lyal, who was personal assistant in charge of opium manufacture, for a series of wall paintings in the Gulzari Bagh opium factory in Patna. But then Lyal is killed in 1857 during the anti-imperial uprising, and the scheme of for the murals is it lapses. Shivalal, however, made use of the design for stock sets on paper and mica. When the botanist John Hooker visited the factory on his way to Sikkim in March 1878, he watched the process of opium manufacture and acquired a set of Shivalal's drawings, which have now ended up at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I take the example of this particular set of drawings to raise three questions. When a set of drawings such as these is exhibited in the imperial metropolis, what role do they play in the function of history as well as that of nostalgia? What critical conversations can such a set of drawings provoke? 3, if the museum has the function of a university today, what knowledge system does such a set of artifacts belong to and perhaps disrupt? The answer to the first question must take into account that these drawings are not on permanent display at the V&A. They are only exhibited occasionally. The inglorious history of the opium trade by the English East India Company is a history that has been erased and invisibilized. It raises uncomfortable questions for the contemporary British subject, especially in the context of a nostalgic reinstation of the British Empire, especially now with Brexit, etc. There is a kind of reinstation of that nostalgia, of a Raj nostalgia for the period of the empire. The critical questions that such a set of drawings can generate, viewed in relation to other objects of rapacious coloniality, are questions that would invite us to review the relationship of the past to the present and of art to the world. The museum today, in the role of a critical platform, needs to provide the space for such conversation and to create other narratives. At the moment, these drawings, when they are on display, are exhibited along with other drawings of occupations in the colonial cataloging narrative. However, the question arises as to whether there are other genealogies that these form a part of. The very term company painting, by placing the English company as central, erases the multiple genealogies of 19th century painting in India. The company is only a fraction of the long and rich history that goes into the making of hybrid painting in the East India Company period, some of which are Persian, Rajasthani, Pahari, Patachitra, the Indian illuminated manuscript editions, for example, the Buddha and the Jaina Bhandaras in Bihar and Gujarat. 19th century painting in India is heir to a hybridity arising from all these varied traditions. In this, it is a deterritorialized style. It is of necessity nomadic and shape-shifting with heterogeneous origins. If these drawings are exhibited along with, now I'm suggesting an alternative to the way of exhibition. If these drawings are exhibited, let's say, along with Persian murakkas or albums, or with Pahari or Rajput paintings, or Patachitras, the lineage of the style would become more apparent. And in that lineage, the English picturesque that these are meant to have arisen from will only be one wheel in the story. In recovering that lost lineage, one also recovers the agency of the artist and the traditions that have shaped them. These drawings also embody the project of colonial modernity in two ways. With their hybrid style, they're harbingers of a changing aesthetic that accommodates the Western realist style, while in their content, they represent an irreducible coloniality, the industrial processing and manufacture of an artificial commodity, opium, whose powers of enslavement were apparent to the intended consumer, the Chinese, resulting, of course, in the Opium Wars. In this manner, painting as commodity can be seen to belong to industrial modernity. They are copied and reproduced to be sold as sets, thus marking a transition of art into commodity culture, into what Walter Benjamin would call the mechanical age of reproduction. Opium, therefore, is a rich metaphor for the arrival of the commodity culture and the art market. In displaying these drawings in the metropolis as examples of company painting, along with sets of drawings of occupations, it gets absorbed into the narrative of the Western encyclopedic imagination. They lose their multiple genealogies of indigenous art traditions, and the violent histories of opium, as well as the story of artists entering the commodity market, are all invisibilized. The museum in the metropolis has to move beyond the racially loaded project of imperial nostalgia via exhibiting the art object as souvenir and imaginatively repositioning the colonial artifact in its discomfiting locations, both historical and aesthetic. The museum, going beyond its role as an archive, can and must facilitate the space for alternative historiographies, for the recovery of the erased and the telling of multiple stories via different arrangements of objects that invite us to reimagine and retrace the historical and aesthetic matrices that they are part of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabitha. What a fascinating story and what wonderful visuals you presented. You know, it was absolutely a treat. And you gave us the subtle shifts of narration and history when art objects move from their locale to the centers of a new metropolis, the whole shift that you've mentioned about, fascinating, absolutely. And of course, you spoke about and you did all this through a fascinating series of paintings, which I had not seen really. The Patna Company School of Paintings, I had not had the privilege of seeing this particular collection. Absolutely fascinating. I think we'll go more into the discussion mode. We'll discuss it in details then. And now we move on to Marion, and you know, she will give us a little story about her German experience.
Thank you so much, and I would love to be with you and in India, of course, at the moment. But yeah, it's very interesting how everybody answered differently to the theme of our panel, contour versus platform. I would present a case study from my institution, which I'm responsible for at the moment. And it's about the healing function of a museum in a still torn society through the effects of 40 years separation of Germany. So the Dresden State Art Collections, that are 15 museums, originated from the Kunstkammer, the Wunderkammer. So you can say it is in a way really a platform. And it's of course also an encyclopedic museum, founded in 1560, so in the 16th century. The art treasures we preserve include ethnography, folk art, scientific objects, the old and new masters in sculpture, painting, graphic art, porcelain, applied arts, archives and libraries, but also treasury art, armory and contemporary art. So you have really a multi-perspective system inside one institution. Our visitors come to us mostly to marvel at this wealth, and you could say to enjoy the aesthetic delight or to enjoy the abundance of art collected over the centuries. We are also speaking from a museum of untold stories because there are so many narrations to tell. However, in addition to our public educational mission, museums are social spaces and public spaces of communication. Here, society finds opportunities for exchange, social and political tensions, charge and discharge. To an even greater extent, in Germany, this discourse often takes place at libraries. That's very interesting, but really libraries are so successful since, I would say, 10 years. And this is where the diversity of our society becomes most apparent. In contrast, museums carry the burden of national institutions with their symbols of power and representation. But the example of the discourse on how to deal with art from the GDR, so eastern part of Germany, show to a particular degree our task and challenge. So we are museums with international collections and visitors, as well as with local audience that sometimes has a calibrated, historically grown view of art and its history. At this moment, the fateful year 2020 interrupted us. For the first time in history, museums around the world closed within 1 week in March 2020. It initially came to an absolute standstill. From the 0 point, two opposing tempi or temporalities developed. A deceleration on one hand, and by shifting into digital space, extreme acceleration to the other, so slowing down and quickness on the other side. The clash of different temporalities, as Italo Calvino has already predicted in 6 proposals for the new millennium, published posthumously in 1991, is also evident in the current tasks facing museums. So we are challenged in terms of our accountability to the past, the need to respond immediately in the present. So the museums and activism is a big new theme now everywhere. And at the same time, to define the museum of the future. The year 2020 was marked by heated social debates, like no other year before, I would say. It is not yet possible to predict how the month-long retreat into isolations will play out in terms of social behavior, lived solidarity, or indeed further social upheavals and extremisms. It is clear, however, that in Dresden, which has been, by the way, called as Germany under a burning glass, the public platforms of exchange are almost existentially necessary. Only to a limited extent, they can be replaced by digital formats. That is also what we learned. I'm happy to explain why. In 2017, the Dresden picture controversy arose. The local audience had missed major works from the times of the GDR in the presentation of our collections. While examining different forms of taking into consideration local art traditions, more profound conflicts came to light, also generational conflicts, I would say. What role can museums and archives play at this point? What role will community curating play as a democratization of the curatorial process? Can we succeed in bringing in the expertise of museum professionals and making the experiences and horizons of a broad public visible? We approached this debate in a very transparent way. So we invited people to a broad-based series of events entitled We Need to Talk, in which many thousands art enthusiasts participated. 2020 again meant 30 years of reunification. Now, with the reopening of some museums in Germany, a new era is dawning. After the experiences of loneliness, the longing for real human encounter is great. After the deprivation of art, at least in a city like Dresden, which defines itself so much through culture, the longing for an encounter with the original is palpable everywhere. The aggressiveness that had broken out surprisingly strongly in the clash between East and West in the recent years seems to have virtually evaporated for the moment, but I don't know how it will be in the next month again. The time and place are therefore idle to launch a model project whose methodology will be transferable far beyond Dresden. 30 years after overcoming the division of Germany, it is important to enter a new phase of empathic social exchange and reconciliation. Empathy means to develop an ability to put oneself in another perceptual perspectives and to be able to take them on. If one takes stock with regard to the reappraisal of German art history and the major exhibitions of recent years that have presented art from 40 years of GDR, one hears cautionary voices. So a canon is just solidifying that has nothing to do with the perceptual perspectives of those who experience the time. We must succeed in shattering false evaluations and in giving space to the complexity of diverse micro-histories, of even autobiographical truth. How can this succeed? As a deductive methodology, a multi-voice group will come together, composed of SKD staff, so from our museum, as well as people from outside the institution, from the local communities, as well as international guests. The group, you could also name them focus group, or will critically reflect and mirror all processes and set its own topics. So you know that it is so difficult to have a radical change of perspective inside your institutions. This is the real challenge. So the SKD collections can already form themselves a large space of thought through this tradition of 600 years history from these most diverse perspectives from the different kinds of collections. With regard to the history of the GDR, one must always keep in mind that the museum itself or its predecessor institution formed an active part of the system during GDR times itself. So that means the collections must be questioned about this and the institutions must be scrutinized. For this reason alone, it is so important to create resonance spaces for perspectives outside of our institutions and to derive consequences for one's own actions from them. Here, the museum's expansion into public space could play an important role. In the times of GDR, the conditions for public space as a politically neutral place that could be used by cultural institutions were not given. So there were no open public outdoor places like that, like today. This is a very simple principle that can be implemented easily with a few means. It should serve to allow such free spaces to open up in different places each time, temporarily and in labs. Sometimes inside our various collections, sometimes outside, for example, on the famous square in front of the Frauenkirche, or to pop up on a private roof terrace. These are, of course, these public platforms. Our idea is to mark corresponding areas, for example, by carpets, outdoors also by foils or other materials, where discussions or performances, exhibitions or workshops can take place. Everything, of course, will be documented and stored in a digital platform, thus the contents remain permanently accessible. So to come to an end, these are the special local circumstances in Dresden. But this type of museum is a platform, is transferable. So this type of a museum as a platform is transferable to, I would say, to every other place in the world. The moderated exchange of opinions can take place in the museum where the diversity of voices can be led side by side. This way, the public can be involved in the re-evaluation of the traditional art historical canon. In the future, we have to integrate the multi-perspective more forcefully. In addition to the micro-perspective of the local public, the macro-perspective of the global public will pave its way to an equal point of view. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marion. Excellent. You know, you told us about, you took a fascinating, and what I was fascinated is that you mentioned that the discord between the East and the West, the dialogues, evaporated after this pandemic thing almost. You don't know how the future will look, but the very fact that a crisis could do this is unbelievable, fascinating. And you've also told us the kind of the multidimensional narration and how public and cultural discourses and discussions resulted in various different perceptions from place to place, from time to time. And of course, you gave us some wonderful case studies while, you sort of, through your experience. Thank you very much. We'll, of course, discuss more as we go into our discussion mode. And now to Oscar, please. And we would love to hear from you now.
Thanks very much, Rakhi. And really a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thanks, Gail and Sabitha and Marion, for your presentations, which are very enlightening to me, all of them in different perspectives. Because as you know, I am a little bit of outsider in this group, in the sense that I am not so much related to art, so directly related to art, and with that kind of knowledge as you have. I would like to thank Alka also for counting on me. And when I said to her that I was an outsider, she said that outsiders are also welcome in this conversation, and perhaps I can bring, some vision from the outside. To start with, I would like to say that as we all know, traditionally to visit a museum was to stand up in front of an object. It was an individual and static experience between the artifact and the spectator. This has been challenged, of course, and visiting a museum has become an interactive and collective affair, as has been shown before me. Artists are encouraged to share their experiences and to engage the audience to participate dynamically as creative agents in a public space. Besides, more and more voices are calling for museums to be an open space for conversation. Some people even say that museums in the 21st century will be key actors in public policy, and that they will assume a role, especially in developing countries, in pioneering social justice and development. Moreover, technological changes undreamt of may completely alter the way we look at the work of art. And this is happening already, as we know. No? I was fascinated by these illusions that Gail showed us, these museums ripping apart, and we have so many technological devices. But I would like to say that my comments here will go a little bit in an opposite direction and reclaim the museum as a place for contemplation, as a place for experiencing rasa, which is the Sanskrit word for aesthetic delight, as an open space for a conversation with oneself. As there are prayer rooms in many public spaces, a museum should have rasa rooms, where the spectator is left alone or in communion with a silent audience to savor the work of art and feel the delight of aesthetic contemplation. For me, this is very important because I would like to claim a unique sphere for art. That sphere should be one of the main concerns of the museum. Art has something that nobody else can offer, the aesthetic experience. The fascination of art lies precisely in its capacity to go beyond necessity and utility, and in its ability to give us a kind of pleasure that cannot be quantified in terms of consumption. And that's very important for me, because we are beyond numbers. We are very much a slave of numbers in this reign of quantity where we live. No? And I think the art experience goes much beyond numbers. No? I remember my Sanskrit teacher in Banaras, she used to say, even if your subject is worth, even if you teach a single person, that is worth doing it. It's not having big crowds, So I would say a small poem, a few notes, a single painting, or a few brush strokes can give an unparalleled satisfaction. The nature of aesthetic experience is such that while taking place in time goes beyond time. while taking place in the materiality of the art object, goes beyond materiality in the aesthetic relish, and it is able for a minute to erase the difference between the outer and the inner world. Again, it is not only pleasure that art gives, but a kind of noetic experience that may change the way you perceive the world. Again, it is not only pleasure in the sense that creates a craving for more, but a fulfilling pleasure that produces an aftertaste that remains with you even after its consumption. This is important because the experience of art is the best way to fight two of the greatest ills of modern society, which are depression and addiction. An aesthetic experience lifts your spirit and does not produce secondary effects. It's not addictive, but on the contrary, liberates your soul. Museums could play an important role in teaching how to enjoy art. Of course, this does not preclude the collective and interactive experience. This does not preclude having museums as open spaces for free speech, as places where art is seen as a process for social change, a place where we can connect the collections to what really matters to the visitors, as having museums as hybrid spaces to gather different public with a common interest. Some even say that in the era of fake news, people are turning to museums for facts. Media is no longer perceived as the defender of truth, and museums should be truth keepers and safe spaces, and to step in as centers for facts and accuracy. All this is okay, but I feel that it is not enough. Museums cannot be mere substitutes for other institutions that are failing. They can help, certainly, but if they forget their exclusive domain, which is the conservation of art and the relishing of it, then museums will be hitting its own doom. And I insist in that because to me it's very important, and sometimes we are lost in the social aspects of our life. But I would say that art has a unique path, which is not shared by any other human activity. For instance, in Sanskrit aesthetics, it is said that unlike common events, an artistic expression is neither true nor false. A work of fiction is not true in the sense that it is a fiction, but it's not false, it's not a lie, it's not an illusion, in the sense that it produces a real experience that changes the perceiving subject, sometimes even for life. This unique path of art culminates in a trans-individual contemplation where the subject and object become just one. The question, for me at least, then would be, what can we do to induce the tasting of rasa, as is said in Sanskrit, rasa charvana, that culminates in the experience of rasa, rasa nubhuti, or the aesthetic experience? For one, I would open the museum to all forms of art. We have seen that already in Gail's presentation where you have somebody singing at the museum, no? And I think that museums should resonate with music, should be full of poetry and open to dramatic representations. A museum should be a resonant box, a sounding board, where visual arts resound with the echo of their sister arts like music and literature. Moreover, as we have already said, museums should be able to create a silent space for contemplation. And as somebody also has remarked, museums should be seen as places for inspiration and reflection, a place to switch off and reconnect with yourself. Somebody also said that museum should work on programs and spaces to be part of healthy places in the city map and to be seen as a part of visitors' workout routine. Well, with these words, I finish my presentation. Thanks very much for allowing me to share this wonderful panel, which has been really enjoyable.
Thank you so much, Oscar. I mean, you mentioned so vividly how history, narration, structure, architecture, they're all crucial in a museum, no doubt. But ultimately, mankind also needs a place to reflect, contemplate, and experience silence, that inner silence. And it's wonderful. I think it's a great idea. And of course, you also told us about how you can create a space where the whole experience of the subject and the object coincide. And it's experience of true rasa, the true inner experience of transcendental kind of an experience. It's wonderful, and your idea for filling up a museum with multidisciplines like museum, performance, and of course the need for that silent space where one can switch off. Great ideas. So now I think we've had a more or less a rounded, discussion through the various, talks, various aspects of a museum. But now what I'll try and do is open up to some questions that we may not have covered. And that is that, if we could, I will be posing a few questions and leading you on to a discussion between the different members of our team today. And some of them are quite interesting in the sense, in context of India, we have always perceived art as holistic in this country. So it was, visual art has been linked, visual art, sculpture, all that is linked with music and dance. If you look at the sculptures in our temples, so it was always a holistic view. Now, throughout the 18th and 19th century, traditionally, museums worldwide, and in India, we didn't have too many museums. Our temples are our museums, but we didn't have the idea of a museum. It came with the West, actually. So, and we didn't believe in museums because, Indians don't like looking back. They like looking forward. So it's very interesting why the idea of a museum never existed in India, actually, till 18th and 19th century, and came through the Western Avenue. But do you think increasingly that we are, as you move into museums worldwide, that they are turning multidisciplinary? Their activities are much more holistic, and there's a lot of interaction between disciplines. Gail, you're the right person since you plan so much. Do you think that is now playing a major role?
Thank you for your excellent summary of every talk. I've been taking notes because it's so marvelous, and the speakers are just so fascinating. I think we could be here for a long time together. Yeah, I think that museums in a way have always been multidisciplinary. I think that what's interesting today is that they are interdisciplinary, which is that the disciplines are speaking to each other. I think that we may be learning from India to see more about the how holistic, in fact, life is, and that the divisions of the disciplines is a kind of result of modernity, well, perhaps going back to the 16th century, something like that. And so we have I think we're struggling to be more interdisciplinary. Whether this takes us to the level of enlightenment that Oscar is talking about is another question. But yeah, I'd be curious about the other speakers.
And how do you think that, since you have planned so many museums, since the agenda is changing, do you think even it's a huge challenge for the architectural aspect of taking these different stakeholders in the museum and create new spaces that can accommodate these different, activities and different, aspects of art today?
Right. So that's a big question, and we live at a time where architecture, I don't know, is given a huge amount of importance because, after all, everybody sees architecture, and even when museums are free, not everybody has the confidence to darken our doors, and this is a reality that I think that we need to understand. So museum architecture has many challenges, but I always phrase everything, they're all cultural, really. There's the challenge of environment. There's the challenge of equity. There's a challenge of access. So these are deeply cultural issues. And I think that often, well, in fact, our whole practice I have 40 people in my company. I mean, our whole practice is based on the understanding that architecture is only part of the solution. It's really a human interaction that has to find the solution, and then the architect works with that. I think that there our sector sort of in a way suffers from the idea, well, our problems are so overwhelming. What will we do about colonialism? What will we do about it? We panic about it. And then we say, okay, well, we'll turn it over to the architect. That's possibly the worst thing you can do. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, Sabitha, since you come from a historical social science kind of a background and literature also, what is the kind of, don't you think that for a museum to be free and to be able to interpret things and to be able to present different aspects of history, we need a free, liberal, democratic, atmosphere. Now, without that free, liberal, democratic atmosphere, how challenging can functioning in a museum be?
You're absolutely right. We do, it's almost a kind of presupposition for the real functioning of a museum that there is an openness to different kinds of opinions. There is actually, the liberal space for accommodating multiple interpretations of a particular artwork. Now we have seen that this is not always the case, and there have been instances of vandalism of museums, for example, or there have been examples of extreme intolerance to objects displayed in a museum. Now, how do we deal with what's happening outside from inside the museum? I think one way to deal with this is to create actually a kind of a space for even actually the intolerant point of view. I mean, I really believe that we need a space for dissent. We need a space for dissent. Yeah. We need a space for multiple perspectives. When we say multiple perspectives, that actually has to really mean all perspectives, which is one way of actually dealing with it. Another way, of course, is to be more tactical in terms of how we present a certain object, or how we present the history of that particular object, or how it interacts with the world. So, but I would actually say it would be good to actually go the more liberal way, and have a space for all kinds of dissent.
Marion, since you have really experienced the whole dialogue between the East and the West of your country, now the whole, when we come to this whole question of dissent, which, mind you, and in a free society, it's quite rampant. How do you handle that, without creating total turmoil and disturbance, and, how do you, since you have been involved with so many different collections and all that, how do you envisage you can do that effectively, and at the same time without squashing certain amount of dissent? Because without dissent, you really cannot have art. As Picasso said, it's like art is not just to decorate your walls, it's just to fight an enemy, So how do you play with that?
It's quite complicated, I must confess, because even if you're very idealistic and you really want to be democratic and give space for every voice and every opinion, of course, there has to be something like a cordon sanitaire. So very often arguments are mixed with racist aspects or anti-Semitist aspects or against women, or it's quite complicated then to react in the right moment, and also to draw the red line. And we had these situations that we had to tell people leave the room. So you need, if it's such an aggressive atmosphere like we had in the last years, you needed moderation, and you need also protection from your staff, for yourself. So I can give you an example. I personally grew up in Turkey, And in a public discussion, the moderator was asking me, how was your experience in the 60s and 70s as a child in Turkey? And I answered, it was a very open-minded liberal atmosphere in Ankara, in the capital. And then the whole audience were telling me, that's not true. And they reacted in a very, very bad way. And I really, I had to leave the space because I couldn't stand it. So I won't tell you here that it's easy. But you have to go on, and we could feel that it was an improvement. So the people started to greet you. The people started to estimate that we had these platforms to meet and to discuss. It was also a generational aspect. The generation born after, they are very curious. They want to have an own voice. They are in between in a way. And my opinion is you have to go through, but you have, of course, a strict, you have to speak about your ethic values, and you have to also to say where the limit is.
You know, contemporary museums, like universities, we have to also encounter a whole lot of new issues, you know, contemporary issues, like the Me Too. You know, I have encountered that. You know, the Me Too issue has become a big thing. So, you know, you will find museums are forced sometimes not to show artworks of a particular artist, or, you know, who has been involved in some sort of a, controversy. And so these are some contemporary issues. I think even museums today, we have to counter, you know, most museums have to counter. So Oscar, coming to all this, how do you place your, you know, how do you think one can come to a kind of settlement between all the chaos and all the dissent and all the uproar and the silence that you have mentioned, you know? We do need that silence in life as well. And museums, to be very honest, have the space to provide that. So how do you think you can integrate the two? On the one hand, you have the uproar, on the other hand, you have questions, and on the other hand, you have this peaceful reflection and contemplation. And how do you interweave the two together?
First of all, I mean, I don't want to get the right impression. I am not speaking about perfection. I am not speaking about enlightenment at all, you know, and maybe I give that impression, but it's not that what I mean, you know. I think everybody has experienced the beauty of a work of art, and that doesn't make us, you know, a special sage in a cave. I think that's a human capacity that we, all of us, have, and it's nothing extraordinary about it, no. And I would say that it's precisely in times like the ones we are today, we are at times full of turmoil, when people more crave for this silence. And when this craving for the silence, I think, creates a lot of opportunities between this lot of noise that we have everywhere, right? I mean, these are very trying times. And we all know, you know, on one side, and I was born in a dictatorship, mind you, you know, because I knew very well what is a real dictatorship. I see now many people complaining about democracy, saying that these democracies are not working, and complaining about politics, parliamentary politics. But be careful, because when you lose all these things and you fall into a real dictatorship, then really your voice is silent. Because if you speak, you know, you will face prison, you will have repression, and we have seen all of that, no? So these are very, as I said, times are changing so fast. We don't know in which direction we go. But as even in the Sanskrit text and even in books, which, you know, Ramcharitmanas, for instance, which I know is not much in vogue now in India, no, because you want to leave behind all these old-fashioned books. But it says that it's precisely in Kali Yuga and in times where things are changing so fast that the humankind develops, you know, a special ability to work on that. So I feel that in spite of all the anguish, and the rising of intolerance, which is happening everywhere. It's happening, you know, in each country, you know, it seems we are becoming, all of us, we are becoming full of reason, you know, we are all becoming opinionated, we think. It seems, you know, that if we are not part of a victim group, we have no identity. We have somehow, you know, to identify ourselves with some kind of oppressed group of people, otherwise we don't exist, no? So this rising of intolerance, of anger, I mean, it's very frightening, I tell you. But it's precisely of that, you know, that we have art is there, museums are there, and we can take
museums are also safety valves, like universities. These are safety valves.
That's why I insist, please, don't reduce museums, you know, to other kind of institutions. And same as an outsider that. Don't think that museums are just social spaces because they are not, they can be that, but they should be much more than that. And they should keep that unique quality that have, you know, which is art, which is one of the most human things that we have.
Absolutely. Any questions? Are we getting any questions from our attendees? We had a few questions, but what are today's museums' roles in the area of social responsibility, diversity, inclusion, etc., to provoke, to promote, to question the same thing that we were discussing?
Well, I would just say that
Yes.
I think
Gail, any?
Well, I think Marion really explained it so very thoroughly in her practice. Museums have an obligation to be accessible to the entire population. I mean, one of the problems, if you like, I've just put it out there, of the last 40 years, I think it was Oscar who said, you know, we have to measure everything. Well, government funding, public funding of museums has declined, even though it's higher in some countries than other countries. The process of the last 40 years has been again, it's all cultural, what is it, economic liberalism, so-called, and the word is actually means the opposite, which often happens, has said that, you know, these are no longer fully public institutions and that they have to raise more money through enterprise. Well, I think that the pandemic has shown us the weakness of that approach, both to universities and to other institutes of learning and to museums. So the result of that has been, on one hand, to increase access, on the other hand, to decrease access. It's actually quite difficult when you look at the complex, if you like, when you look at the data. So I think that understanding that museums exist in the public realm, they're for the public, and how we work with that is very, very, very important. And this reckoning of Black Lives Matter, of Me Too, of the justice movements in the world really remind us of our responsibilities in that respect.
Gail, if I can say something.
We have one question saying that, you know, the Hindi and the Bengali word for museum is Jadughar. And the Jadughar, the meaning of Jadughar is the magic room. And this is a very revealing name. And how do museums perceive, this is the way that museums are perceived in this culture. How do you like the idea of this whole Jadughar, you know, which is like the magic world, you know, that is how they describe all our museums, most of our museums, the Hindi or the vernacular term for it is the Jadughar, which is what, you know, it's the magic room. So that was one of the questions. I think it's more a statement than a question. We have another question. When I think of audience in the post-COVID-19 world, I think of distraction and divided attention, moving towards, do you anticipate a loss of interest in the museum experience? Can the panelists speak to plans to further engage audiences?
I just wanted to say one thing, you know, and maybe you can give a better answer than the one, but before the COVID, and I think we shouldn't be overly pessimistic in the sense that before the COVID, I used to see the museums in Spain were full to the brim. I mean, you have to queue to enter a museum like El Prado, or to go to the Picasso Museum in my city, Barcelona, or to go to the Alhambra. And that happens all over Europe, you know. I mean, now the pandemic setting, and people cannot travel, and the museums, you know, had to adapt to different circumstances. But I would say, you know, that I don't know what you think, Gail or Marion, no, or Sabitha, but I think that in many places in Europe, and I think in Germany is the same thing, museums were full, and people was really queuing to enter and see these works of art. So I shouldn't be too pessimistic on that. And I hope that once the pandemic is over, maybe we can regain that flow of visitors to museums.
We have a wonderful thing for you, Oscar, from an artist
But I think
in
Marion
New York.
wanted to say something.
Oh, you wanted to say something?
No,
I have something for Oscar. Museums maintaining that spiritual or special individual connection to art is so essential. Thank you for bringing that up in the discussion on evolving museum spaces. So that was for you, Oscar. It's from Ilan Auerbach from New York. He's a sculptor, if I'm not mistaken. He's a very important sculptor based in New York. And any other, can the panelists speak on the plans to further engage? Oh, that's the previous one. Any more questions? Any more questions? Any more questions? No more? So we are fine, and you know, we have just listened to a scintillating series of stories, exchange of ideas, and debate on the contemporary concept of a museum as an open space for conversation. If we accept the existing of myriad stories of evolving human civilizations, then we also have to accept the historical facts of migration, cultural encounters, and fusions that evolved through thousands of years. A country like India is a living testimony of that too. To witness slices of that history and understand its intricacies and ramifications, museums become the invariable sites of discovery, discourse, and intellectual inquiries. In a free world of today, Romila Thapa, reputed historian of India, reminded us, we have the right to have a right. Thus, ideas, narratives, and histories cannot be thrust from the top. Every citizen of the world deserves the freedom of choice, the freedom to interpret and dissent. Museums, like universities, provide that sacred space of inquiry, a place to reflect, understand, express, and communicate, while reserving all rights to raise questions and dissent. As Picasso so vociferously declared, art is not a decoration for the walls. It is an offensive and defensive against the enemy. What better place to prove that than the sanctum sanctorum of a museum, making it vibrant, alive, and a part of our life and our hopes. So with that, we are ending our discussion today. Thank you so much, all our speakers, Sabitha, Marion, Oscar, and Gail. You've been wonderful. Thank you to all our attendees across the world. We hope to meet you soon. And this pandemic at least has brought us all on the same platform. And I am most grateful to Bihar Museum for organizing this wonderful, wonderful interaction. Thank you, Dr. Pandey, Alka Pandey, for making this possible for all of us. Thank you once again. All the best.